Hello, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to be learning just a little bit about histology. So histology is the study of tissues. We're going to actually be looking at some slides, so at some images of preserved tissues on microscope slides as viewed through a microscope. And so just a little bit of background about histology. So histology, of course, is the study of tissues. As I said, there are 4 different classes of tissues that are found within the human body. And generally, these tissues are going to be working together within an organ, ultimately producing the function of said organ. So what we can see here is the stomach. So just a second here. You, of course, ingest food, you take a bite of hamburger, you chew it up, you swallow it down your esophagus, right? And finally, that food ends up in this opening, this cavity within the stomach. And so a lot of our organs, our stomach included, contain what is called a lumen. So the lumen is just the opening inside the organ. And I bring that up now because in general, this is kind of like a starting point for how you're going to start examining these tissue slides. Here is epithelial tissue, right? So if we take a section of tissue from the stomach wall, we'll see that this open space here is the lumen, so that's where the food would be, and always we have epithelial tissue that lines the lumen. And so again, what I recommend when you start looking at these slides is to look for the white space, and that is generally the lumen, and whatever tissue is immediately adjacent to that is going to be epithelial tissue. Okay? Always deep to the epithelial tissue is connective tissue. Right? There's actually a wide variety of connective tissues. It's not just connecting epithelium to deeper tissues. There's also a lot of structural components to connective tissue as well. All right, next we can see muscle tissue. All right, so muscle tissue is contractile. It allows for the motility of the stomach. So essentially churning together that food that you just ate with the digestive juices, unraveling or denaturing proteins, and so on and so forth. And actually embedded within that muscle tissue, but not exclusively within muscle tissue, we have nervous tissue. And so nervous tissue is responsible for, of course, sending messages and controlling these different types of tissues and structures. Okay? What we can see at this point is that looking at a tissue slide, so looking at histology is never or generally not going to be just one type of tissue. For the most part, these slides are taking actually a section through these organs. And so you're going to see a lot of different things at the same time. And so let me give you an example here. Okay. All right, so what we can see here is the trachea. Right, so essentially your throat here, you can feel these ridges all the way down the front of your neck. That is your trachea, and what those ridges actually are cartilaginous discs. So essentially keeping your airways open, you know, even if you're swallowing, even if, you know, you hit whatever, these airways need to remain open at all times. If we want to look at the structures of the trachea, what we could do is take a section through the trachea, okay, and we could take a very thin section, put it onto a slide, stain it, right? Normal cells aren't all sorts of pretty colors and everything. We would stain it, and of course different cells, different organelles are going to absorb different stains a little bit differently, so this is how we can start to differentiate between structures here. And what we would see if we just took a plain old section through the trachea is this image down here. Okay, and so what we can see is all sorts of different colors, all sorts of things going on, but in general we have this nice C-shaped cartilaginous disc. Okay. This is the lumen, so this is where you would see air. Okay. And as always, I definitely recommend starting to look for the white space, the lumen in the middle. The tissue that is going to be lining that is epithelial tissue, then connective tissue, and in this case, we have hyaline cartilage as well. And actually, back here, we have a little bit of muscle, which helps you to cough, and it helps your esophagus to actually extend into your trachea a little bit when you are swallowing. Okay. And so, for the most part, looking at slides at this particular level doesn't really tell us that much. And so we generally want to zoom in even farther, which is what this image over here is showing you. This is similar to a lot of the slides that you're going to be looking at in this lab. All right, so up here is the air. This is the lumen or the open space. Okay, so epithelium is always going to be lining that lumen, and so this first layer of tissue is what we will soon learn is pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. All right, then this kind of patchy stuff here is going to be connective tissue. All right, we can see that these little circles here are the nuclei of the cells, and so they're kind of irregularly arranged, kind of like patchy, as opposed to in the epithelium where we have kind of these clear rows of nuclei within those cells. So definitely a lot more organized in the epithelium. Right. Deep to the normal connective tissue, which again we'll get into, we can see that there are these big white openings. We'll learn later that these are called lacunae. These are essentially little holes in which cartilage cells are going to live. And that's a telltale sign that this tissue is cartilage. And then beyond that, we have a little bit more connective tissue as well. And so we are going to walk through the 4 different categories of tissue and then the specific subcategories within those tissues. Keep in mind that for the most part, when you just look at the slide, it just looks like a bunch of pink and purple. We want to hone in on the details, right? So I'm going to be drawing things out for you, giving you kind of an idealized image in your mind of what these tissues are supposed to look like. And then you kind of have to use your imagination a little bit. Life is very diverse, life is different, and so not all tissues are going to look exactly what they would look like in the textbook. Okay, so let us start drawing our charts here. Okay. All right, so let us start with the first of 4 different categories of epithelial tissue, or of tissue within the body, and we'll start with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, oh my goodness, I can type here. As I have briefly mentioned before, is responsible for covering or lining structures, right? So this includes, lining the lumen, of course, lining this opening within our stomach, within our trachea, etc., but also covering our body. And so epithelial tissue provides this really protective barrier. We'll talk all about that in lecture. Another feature of epithelial tissue is that it has a top and a bottom, right? So it has the surface that is exposed to either the lumen or the outside world, and then the other surface, which is deeper facing into your body. And so we can say that the apical surface is facing out, right, or into the lumen, and the basal surface is facing connective tissue. It's facing into the body. Okay. In general, on that note, the basal surface always has what is called a basement membrane, also sometimes called a basal lamina. Oh my goodness, I can type today. Right, so basal membrane or basal lamina. So this is essentially the bottom of the tissue, the one that is the deeper side. Okay, so I will include the basement membrane on these drawings that we're going to be doing together. Okay, so epithelial tissues can be classified according to 2 different characteristics. Let's see how I want to do this here. The first characteristic is the shape of the cells. And so there are 3 different shapes. We have stratified, sorry about that. We have squamous or squamous. We have cuboidal, and we have columnar. Right? So even just the names of these things is going to, oh my goodness, sorry, going to kind of tell us approximately what the shape is. So let's draw in, first and foremost, here is the basal lamina. Okay. Right, so this is pointing down and into the body. Squamous cell, or squamous cells in squamous tissue, are long and skinny. Okay? And so these are pretty much flat, or they are squished. Okay? And so as always, you should be thinking about what is the structure, how does the structure match the function. And so squamous tissue have really, really thin cells. And so pretty much it is really difficult for, or sorry, it is really easy for substances to pass over the surface of these cells. There's like hardly any organelles in the way, and so things like respiratory gases can very easily just slip over these membranes, no problem, right? There's really not much in the way. Okay, so this is squamous tissue, and in fact, the fact that there is just a single layer of these squished little cells leads us to our next type of classification. So this is called completely simple squamous epithelial tissue. And in general, for the epithelial tissues, I want you to give me 4 terms in order to, have a fully correct answer. Simple, right? So just one layer of cells attached to that basement membrane. Squamous, those cells are squished, and of course, it is epithelial tissue. And sometimes you also hear it referred to as epithelium. That is a completely accurate term, but just to be consistent, I would like 4 words: simple squamous epithelial tissue. Okay. All right, so this simple squamous epithelial tissue is found in, it's found in places that want very rapid diffusion. So for example, the alveoli of the lungs. Right, so essentially we need really rapid gas exchange, so the membrane between the air and our blood is as thin as it possibly can be, and so simple squamous epithelial tissue is literally the thinnest tissue that we can possibly have. And so this here is a, well, the image that I have drawn for you is a cross-section through this tissue. So it's a cross-section through this tissue. You can also see this tissue flattened out, right? So looking at the entire membrane, and one of the images that I have for you to take a look at online is going to reveal that to you as well. Okay, next, the simple cuboidal tissue, right? As I said, these names kind of imply what shape they are. So cuboidal cells are roughly cubed in shape, right? So for a simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, what we have are cells that are roughly as tall as they are wide. And so I do want to point out that a lot of times it's really difficult to see the plasma membrane that separates these cells. So you are pretty much going to be looking for the nuclei, right? The nuclei always stain pretty darkly, and so you'll be able to see that just based on the spacing of the nuclei that the cells are roughly cube-shaped as opposed to really squished, right? So the nuclei are farther apart in squamous than they would be in cuboidal. And so what we can see with simple cuboidal tissue is that now there is more cytoplasm, there's more space inside the cell, and therefore more organelles than there would be in the squamous tissue. And so what this means is that there's a lot more potential for these cells to actually be making stuff and either secreting or absorbing stuff as well. So we can see that if we think about the function of this particular tissue, you know, what types of structures would need a lot of secretory and absorptive ability? Well, your kidney tubules. Okay, so essentially, your urine is going to be flowing through these little tubules called nephrons, and essentially secreting and absorbing stuff into and out of the blood, making sure that all the levels of calcium and hormones and everything are exactly right. Okay, so the kidney tubules are lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. Also, the ovary also secretes all sorts of lovely things like hormones and such. And so the ovary also has simple cuboidal epithelial tissue as well. Okay. All right, so next, let's talk about columnar. Right, so this is the tissue that is roughly, or the cells are taller than they are wide. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so taller than they are wide. We are still talking about simple tissue, which means that there is only one layer of cells. All of those cells are attached to the basement membrane. And so we saw this when we looked at the stomach. Right? Once again, sometimes it's really difficult to see the divisions between the cells, but you can always see the nuclei. And so, in simple columnar epithelial tissue, generally the nuclei are all in a nice little line, but we can also see that there's a lot more cytoplasm either on top or on bottom of this line of nuclei. And also sometimes there are little things on the top here. These are called microvilli, and they're essentially increasing the surface area of this particular tissue. And so that's important because this simple columnar epithelial tissue is also fantastic, and in fact even better at secreting and absorbing things. Right now there's even more cytoplasm per cell than there was in the cuboidal tissue, and so now these cells are chock full of all sorts of organelles which are pumping out proteins and lipids and all sorts of lovely things. And so simple columnar tissue is found lining your intestines. And so this could include the ileum or the jejunum. And so when you look at these slides after watching this video, you will see a section of ileum or jejunum. Again, look for the lumen. That's where your food would be, and so these cells would be responsible for secreting extra enzymes or extra like buffers into your intestines, as well as absorbing digested food. Okay, so all the tissues we've looked at so far have only a single layer of cells, all of which are attached to that little blue line there, the basement membrane. But as you might imagine, that is not always the case. We also have stratified tissues. So a stratified squamous epithelial tissue would have the basement membrane as always, but now instead of having one single super thin layer of cells, now there are going to be multiple layers of cells. So not all of them are going to be contacting the basement membrane. Right, so just to speed this up a little bit here, these are all multiple layers of cells. Okay, they're not beautiful cells, but they are multiple layers of cells nevertheless. Okay. In general, you are again looking for the nuclei. These cells are super flat, and oftentimes the more superficial layers, so the farther you get from the basement membrane you are, these cells actually die off, right? So the cells get flatter and flatter and flatter as they move more superficially, and oftentimes it's a little bit misleading. Generally, the first layer of these cells in stratified squamous epithelial tissue, they almost look cuboidal. The reason for that is that these are generally stem cells and they're constantly dividing, so they actually need all sorts of stuff in their cytoplasm. Right? So again, the first layer attached to the basement membrane will look cuboidal, but it's not actually considered to be cuboidal just because these cells give rise to the squamous tissue more superficially. Okay? Essentially what this tissue is good for is serving as more or less a disposable protection for your body. So for example, your epidermis, the outermost layer of your skin, is made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And so what that does is it allows us kind of the freedom of like bumping into things and scratching things and everything without actually damaging our tissue, right? So the uppermost layers are dead, and so they can just slough off, and they do slough off all the time. But it's not a big deal, right? There's so many other layers of these cells underneath that you know, you don't actually hurt yourself when you bump into things. Let's see. Oh, the other thing is that these cells, because there's like hardly any cytoplasm, they're relatively cheaply made, right? So we can just be cranking out more of these cells all the time, and so really no big deal when you lose some of these cells. In fact, you're supposed to lose a lot of these cells all the time. And so our skin is reinforced with a molecule called keratin. So keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. This helps us to keep moisture inside of our body as well. But not all stratified squamous epithelial tissue is keratinized. Pretty much any structure that's exposed to the outside world is going to have this particular type of tissue. But some of those structures are constantly moistened with saliva or mucus, and so they don't actually need that protective protein called keratin. So what I'm talking about is, for example, in your oral cavity and down your esophagus, you know, you take a bite of potato chips, right? And there's all those little pieces, and you know, they're kind of scratching at the inside of your mouth. You swallow them and they're scratching down the sides of your esophagus. No big deal, because you have lots and lots of layers of this stratified squamous tissue. And again, that is not keratinized because it is constantly being moistened by saliva. Okay, so for example, your esophagus. Okay, next, stratified cuboidal tissue is super rare. It is found lining the mammary glands, and what you will look at is some of the esophageal, oh, that's it, esophageal glands. Okay, and so generally these tissues are, this particular super rare tissue, by the way, is lining ducts. And say, I'm just going to draw it out for you that way. Right, generally, there are no more than 2 layers of these cells. Okay. They are roughly cuboidal in shape, so roughly as tall as they are wide. We can see in the middle of this little cross section through a tube that there is a lumen, so that is where either saliva would be or milk in the case of mammary glands. Right, and so this is what you would kind of see. And generally surrounding these tubes is like all sorts of extra connective tissue, muscle and nervous tissue and all. But when you look at the mammary glands, for example, or the esophageal glands, you need to focus on the little hole worth of white. That is what's going to be lined by this type of tissue. Okay. So again, super rare in the body. Finally, stratified columnar doesn't technically exist, but what does exist is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial tissue. And so this is found in places like the trachea. Okay. Yeah, so just in the trachea. So what is the difference between pseudostratified and stratified? Well, as always, we have a basement membrane, but this time, instead of having nice, organized layer of columnar cells, now the cells are a little bit more unorganized, right? So the way that you can tell pseudostratified versus simple columnar epithelial tissue is generally, again, looking for those nuclei, right? So you'll have some up here, you'll have some down here, and essentially this tissue is going to look like it is stratified, but if you look closely, all of these cells technically are attached to that basement membrane. And again, there are oftentimes cilia on this type of tissue, right? And that's actually important in keeping gunk, things like pollen, things like particulates and bacteria and whatnot out of your lungs. Okay, so those are the first 6. Again, when you're classifying epithelial tissues, make sure that you tell me 4 words for all 6 of these: simple squamous epithelial tissue, pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, etc. As always, there is an exception to this rule, one that doesn't exactly fit nice and neatly into this chart, and this is called transitional epithelial tissue. Okay. And so this is the one epithelial tissue for which you only have to give me 3 words instead of 4 words. And it is a little bit different than the others in that it doesn't always look the same. All right, so here's the basement membrane. When this tissue is relaxed, right, these cells look almost like little fish scales, right? So they're nice and curved, they're not really round or square and rigid like the other ones that we've seen. There are always multiple layers of these things, and again, they look like fish scales. And I'm sorry, I'm not very good at drawing with the mouse here, but I hope you get the idea. Okay, of course, nuclei throughout. Okay, okay. So I said when this tissue is when it's relaxed. Okay, so that implies that there are kind of 2 different states of this tissue. That is, it transitions from one state to the next. Essentially, this type of tissue is used to line structures that stretch out a lot, right? So things like the urinary bladder. Okay, so sometimes it's empty-ish. Other times you just had, a big gulp and it's super full, right? And so this tissue has to be able to expand and then return to its original configuration so that urine doesn't leak out into your pelvic cavity. Okay, so the top image that I just drew for you is relaxed. So that's, you just went to the bathroom and your bladder is as, relaxed as it's going to be, as empty as it's going to be. When you go to the movies again, you drink one of those huge sodas, your bladder fills up and you don't want to miss any of the movie, and so you hold it as long as you physically can, and so your urinary bladder wall is going to stretch out quite considerably. Right? So when the bladder is stretched, the cells look more like squamous cells. When the bladder is relatively empty, the cells look slightly more cuboidal in shape. Okay. Let's see, another place where this is found is the ureters or ureters. So these are the tubes that carry urine from your kidney all the way down to your urinary bladder. Okay, so those are the epithelial tissues. Again, for most of them, you need to give me 4 words. For transitional, you only need to give me 3 words because the stratified is just implied. Okay, so now let us move on to connective tissues. All right, so the connective tissues have a lot in common. They are very diverse, but in general, they have, they're made up of mostly proteins. So things like collagen, reticular fibers, and elastic or elastin fibers. Okay, there's always some kind of fluid, right? Usually this is called ground substance or plasma. Yeah, so lots of proteins, lots of fluid. These are never exposed to the outside world, so they're always covered by epithelial tissue. The only reason why connective tissue should be sticking out and exposed to the outside world is if you hurt yourself, so if you damage the epithelial covering. Okay. Connective tissues, just like the epithelial tissues, can be classified according to a couple different characteristics. We are going to start with the connective tissue proper. So this is what you would actually think of as being a connective tissue, all right? So you don't think of blood as being a connective tissue, but it is. So starting with the connective tissue proper, the two characteristics that we're going to start, to differentiate these tissues is essentially the density of those protein fibers, so this extracellular matrix. Okay, these protein fibers can either be loosely arranged or they can be densely arranged, right? So that usually the first term of a connective tissue's name is whether it's loose or it's dense. And so let's start with the loose. The most common connective tissue in the entire body is called loose areolar connective tissue. Okay, and so the reason that this is so darn common is because it is literally deep to every epithelial tissue in the body. All right, so whenever you start looking at a tissue slide, you're going to find the lumen, identify the epithelial tissue, and then just deep to that, you will see loose areolar connective tissue every time, always. And so this, this particular tissue has a lot of disorganized, loosely arranged collagen fibers. So that is what this red is going to be representing. Mixed in with those collagen fibers are going to be specialized cells, which you will identify by their nuclei, as always. Right? So these cells are generally called fibroblasts, and we'll talk in lecture about what they do and the terminology behind them and whatnot. But fibroblasts, you also might have adipocytes, so fat cells as well. But pretty much just like this loosely arranged configuration of tissue. Right? So the slides where you're going to find this tissue is pretty much anything. Right? So anywhere you see an epithelium, you will always see loose areolar connective tissue deep to it. Okay. Next, we have loose adipose connective tissue. And so yes, adipose is fat. Fat is found, for example, in the hypodermis, so at the deepest part of your skin. Adipose is surrounding organs. If you looked closely in that trachea slide, you might have seen some like chunky white cells all the way to the outside. That is loose adipose connective tissue. Okay. In your online lab today, you will also see this in the mesentery, right? But pretty much you have fat everywhere, and that's a good thing. We need this extra energy storage. Okay, so how exactly does fat look? How is it different? First of all, adipose is pretty darn hard to see because fat, these lipids, it's pretty white, right? It's really difficult to actually see. Okay, just like with the areolar connective tissue and any connective tissues, most of the tissue is actually made up of protein fibers as opposed to cells like the epithelial tissue. But here in the adipose itself, those protein fibers are like wedged in between these poor little cells, right? So it's just like squished in between. Okay, so again, adipose is generally like superficial on the organs. It can be a little bit difficult to see because the cells are white, but they're big, they're globular, and of course they're filled with our favorite fat. All right, finally, loose reticular connective tissue. This tissue is found in lymphatic organs. So things like your lymph nodes, things like your spleen. Okay, so what the heck is this? Well, loose reticular connective tissue has a lot of reticular fibers as opposed to collagen, as opposed to elastin. So I'm going to draw these in a darker color here. These fibers are essentially creating like a mesh. So think about a cotton ball. There's fibers going every which way. And the reason why they need to create this mesh is because there are other cells, namely white blood cells, that populate the lymph nodes and the spleen. And they are ultimately patrolling tissue or patrolling fluid, lymph fluid, that is flowing through these like cotton ball filters of lymph nodes to look for anything that doesn't quite belong. All right, so when you look at a spleen slide, when you look at a lymph node slide, you're going to see a ton of these cells. And so these cells are called lymphocytes, and you'll see a nucleus surrounded by a larger cytoplasm. So that's what that's going to look like right there. Okay, dense connective tissues essentially have the same types of fibers as the loose connective tissues, but there's a heck of a lot more of them. Within the dense, those fibers can be arranged either regularly, so nice and parallel to each other, or irregularly. All right, so dense, regular. This type of tissue is found in your tendons, in your ligaments. Okay? And so your tendons and ligaments are essentially the strappy structures that are attaching either your muscles to your bones or your bones to another bone. And so essentially whenever you are moving a particular muscle, the pull, the force is always in the same direction. And so we make that connective tissue, actually, connecting the muscle to the bone, really robust in that direction only and not in any other direction. Okay, so that's different from irregular tissue. We'll get to that in just a moment. In dense, regular connective tissue, the fibers are nice and parallel to each other. You might see them a little bit wavy depending on whether the tissue is stretched out or not before it goes onto the slide. But in general, lots and lots of collagen, all nice and parallel to each other. You will see some tiny little cells that are wedged in there, but for the most part, this is almost entirely collagen fibers. Okay, and again, dense regular connective tissue is really strong in one direction, but if you pull it in the opposite direction of the fibers, you just like pull the tissue apart. And so not every structure only needs to be strong in one direction. So we also have dense irregular connective tissue. And so this is found in places that experience stress from lots of different directions. So for example, the dermis of your skin, of course, isn't just always being pulled in one direction. It is being, bumped and pulled and scraped in all sorts of different directions. And so it needs to be super strong in all of those directions. Also, capsules around your joints and around your organs. Okay, so of course your joints are, moving a lot of different ways, especially like your elbow doesn't just do this, but there's also some turning, pronation, and supination up here as well. Organs, of course, are always moving and gliding, and so we need a lot of strength in a lot of different directions. And so when you look at this tissue, you will see that the collagen fibers are kind of arranged in these little patches. All right, so very patchy, and we'll take a look at the skin slide here eventually. And of course, the nuclei are visible between those patches. Okay. The final type of tissue is not something you're going to actually be looking at in the lab today, but just to be thorough here, dense elastic connective tissue also has a ton of these collagen fibers very densely packed together, but, or collagen fibers as well as elastin fibers, right? So the difference here is that these structures are constantly stretching out. They need to stretch and recoil. So places like your aorta, I have a layer of elastic connective tissue within them, because every time your heart beats, that aorta stretches out to accept more blood from your left ventricle and then recoils again between your cardiac cycles before, or between your heartbeats. Okay, so again, this elastic connective tissue is not going to be on your lab, but I do want you to be aware that that is a thing. Okay, so connective tissues, mostly protein, right? So mostly extracellular matrix. They do have a lot of specialized cells within them, and we'll talk more about that in the lecture. They are classified according to how loosely or densely their protein fibers are arranged, and of course the orientation of those protein fibers. These are the connective tissue proper. Okay, there are also connective tissues that are not connective tissue proper, and so, all right, so these are continuation of the connective tissues. Okay. The next type of connective tissues are the cartilages. Okay, so also mostly extracellular matrix, specialized cells living within them. 3 different types of cartilage. First of all is hyaline cartilage, and this is by far the most abundant type of cartilage. It is found at the ends of your long bones, so within your joints. It is found as your costal cartilages, so on your ribs, right? So allowing you to inhale and exhale, your ribs kind of flex back and forth, so they have a lot of cartilage involved. So costal cartilages, so these are your ribs. And so mostly everywhere that you have cartilage is hyaline cartilage. This is also really important in the formation of bones to begin with. Okay, so as we looked at on the trachea slide, there are little holes called lacunae, we'll get into that later, within this kind of jelly-like matrix of the cartilage. Within those little holes are the specialized cartilage cells called chondrocytes, right? Chondro means cartilage. And so surrounding these little holes here are, you know, again, this like jelly matrix here, right? So it is light in color, it is stained, oftentimes it is actually purple. But this is essentially a lot of proteins that kind of trap water molecules within it, so it provides this nice squishy, flexible structure that is still pretty robust to tearing. Okay. You will take a look at hyaline cartilage within the trachea. Okay. Yeah, in the trachea. Okay. All right, the next type of cartilage is the elastic cartilage. And so this looks more or less the same with a couple modifications here. All right, so we also have this nice little jelly matrix here. All right, but this time there are also fibers, right? Specifically, we have elastic fibers, right? So we have they are stained a little bit more darkly, and they look kind of irregularly arranged surrounding those. Oops. All right, surrounding those little cells within their lacunae. Okay. So again, a lot more rigid, a lot more fibers embedded within that kind of jelly-like matrix. Okay. There are two places where you can see elastic cartilage in the body. One of them is your epiglottis. So essentially the little flap that covers over your respiratory system every time you swallow so that nothing goes down the wrong tube. Okay. More familiar with you guys perhaps are your ears, right? So your external ears, your arcals or your pinna. This is elastic cartilage, so very flexible material. Also avascular, so no blood going to these tissues. So here also your ears. Okay. And finally, the third and final type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. Okay, and once again, we have this jelly-like matrix, all right, just like we've seen before. Okay, there are still the chondrocytes embedded within the lacunae, these little cavities here, but this time the fibrocartilage has even more and very dark fibers, right? So lots of collagen in order to reinforce that cartilage. And so we would see this type of tissue in places that get a lot of wear and tear. So for example, the menisci or meniscuses of your knee, right? So these nice cushions, but they get torn a lot, right? They get a lot of wear and tear. Also your intervertebral discs, okay, right? You're doing jumping jacks and they're constantly like being compressed, and you know, you're doing yoga, whatever. You need to have a lot of rigidity there. And finally, your pubic symphysis, so the joint that is actually holding together the two halves of your pelvis. Okay, so that's cartilage. Another type of connective tissue is actually bone, right? So you wouldn't think of that as being connective, but it does in fact contain specialized cells. It does in fact contain a ground substance or this extracellular fluid. It does in fact contain mostly proteins, which happen to be calcified as well. And so there are a couple different types of bone, and we'll definitely get into this more later, but the particular type of bone that I want you guys to recognize is called compact bone. Okay, and compact bone is actually organized in such a way that it is it has these little cylinders with embedded what are called lamellae, so like layers of bony tissue. Okay, so this is probably like the easiest tissue that you're going to be identifying. Each of these little rings here is called an osteon. There's blood that comes up through the middle here in the central canal. There are little cavities here filled with those specialized cells, which we'll later call osteocytes, but this here is bone, right? So pretty straightforward there. All right, finally, sorry, my phone seems to be, there we go, much better. Final type of connective tissue is actually going to be blood. All right, so mostly protein extracellular matrix embedded within fluid, so and specialized cells. There are a couple specialized cells that I want you to be aware of. As you might imagine, blood has red blood cells, and so they're not always stained quite as darkly as this, but they should indeed have a reddish tint. Blood cells are anucleate, so you will not see a nucleus. It's just kind of a plasma membrane surrounding a ton of hemoglobin. Okay, so those are the red blood cells. White blood cells are a little bit different. They are generally stained some shade of purple. They are much larger for the most part than red blood cells are. And they have wacky nuclei. All right, so the ones that you'll most commonly see are probably neutrophils. They have a multi-lobed cell nucleus, right? You might see some monocytes, for example, right? So this big kind of U-shaped nucleus here. Right, so anything that isn't red and is bigger than red is a white blood cell. When you look through your lab today, you'll be able to point out neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, etc. Right, so if it's not a red blood cell, probably a white blood cell. Next semester you will learn all about that. Final type of structure within the blood that I want you to be familiar with, there are tiny little cell fragments that are really important in the blood clotting process. Those are called platelets. So again, we have the red blood cells, we have the white blood cells, and platelets are the fragments. Okay, that's the end of the connective tissues. Two more types of tissues, but these are a lot more straightforward. We have the muscle tissue, and we have the nervous tissue. So we are almost done here, guys. So the muscle tissue, we have skeletal muscle tissue. Okay. In this tissue, if you zoom all the way into the cells, which are called myocytes or myofibers, I'll talk about this more later, but if in your lab you zoom into the myocytes or myofibers, what you will see is parallel cells, right? So this here is a cell membrane or section of cell membrane. Here is another cell, right? Within those cells, you will see what are called striations. Oops. So you will see these little stripes. Okay, and so this is essentially overlapping proteins within the cells, and that's what gives rise to our ability to contract the muscles. All right, so here are two adjacent cells, all right, two adjacent skeletal muscle cells. They are striated, so they are stripy. They have lots of nuclei, so they are multinucleate, and they're really long and relatively skinny. Okay. As opposed to the smooth muscles. All right, so the smooth muscle is found within our organ visceral walls. All right, so this is what gives motility to our organs. All right, so these cells, instead of being super long and skinny, are kind of tapered at the end. Okay, and they form these like sheets or layers of the organ wall. Right, they only have a single nucleus apiece. Right, so they're not multinucleate, just like the skeletal muscles are. And in general, when you look at a tissue slide, you'll see the epithelium, you'll see connective tissue, and then deep to that, dense irregular connective tissue or whatever it is, you will see stripes of this smooth muscle tissue. Okay, sometimes, well, oftentimes actually, organs will have multiple layers of these of smooth muscle tissue. Some of them will be going around the organ, so like around your intestine. Others will be going along the intestine. And so oftentimes what you'll see is, for example, here's a longitudinal layer that I've drawn for you, and then like right under that you will see sections through other smooth muscle cells. Okay, so usually there are going to be two layers. You will see smooth muscle today in the small intestine and the gallbladder. Both of these need some mechanism for moving stuff along. Okay. And finally, in the muscles here, the cardiac muscle is similar and different to the skeletal and smooth muscles. the cells are short as opposed to long, right? So they're similar to smooth muscle in that they are short. They are uninucleate, so only one nucleus apiece, right? But the cardiac muscle, these cells are branched, right? So as you can see here, one single cell with one single nucleus is branched. They are striated, so they've got these stripes just like the skeletal muscles do. And again, that is just from overlapping protein fibers. Okay, the most defining characteristic are these little, these little jagged cell connections. They are called intercalated discs, right? So these are essentially going to electrically couple adjacent cardiac muscle cells or cardiomyocytes, so that as soon as an electrical signal is generated, the entire heart can contract together, the entire chamber can contract together, and therefore push the blood a little bit farther. Okay, so you will have the opportunity to zoom in on the intercalated discs. Those are just the little jagged or darker lines in between the muscle cells. Okay, and finally, we come to the nervous tissue. So the lab that I have for you guys today, it has a lot of different types of nervous tissue. It has, the brain, the spinal cord, and all sorts of different things. But we are not quite there yet. So in the assignment, you can see one of the slides showing you what I am about to draw for you here. So nervous tissue has specialized cells called neurons. Okay, so neurons are the functional cells, the functional units of the nervous system. These are what essentially detect a signal and then generate an electrical stimulus and then send that message far away. And so this kind of branched star-like, much larger cell that you see here is a neuron. But of course, neurons can't function on their own. There are lots of other, other little cells that look kind of fluffy, right? So it just looks like a bunch of mesh almost surrounding them. And these are the kind of helper cells, and they are called neuroglia. Right, so neuroglia, lots of different types, and we will get into that later. Okay, so those are the 4 classes of tissue. Right, so if a question on a lab practical or a lecture exam asks you what class of tissue or what category of tissue, epithelial, connective, muscle, nervous tissue review. Those are the only answers. If I'm asking for specific tissues, please give me the simple squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, so at this time, please take the opportunity to review these notes, take a look at the extra resources that I posted for you guys, and finally, start looking through those slides that you guys have online. Okay, thank you guys very much for joining me today, and I will see you again